Tanzania is burning, and this time the fire is no longer just in the streets. It's crawling toward the very heart of power, toward the family of President Samia Suluhu Hassan, toward the influencers and stars who once sang praises of her rule. What began as a protest over corruption and heavy-handed governance has become something no one expected: a people's reckoning. In Dar es Salaam, Arusha, and Mwanza, the night air glows orange with the flames of rebellion. You can hear the roar of the crowds between bursts of tear gas. You can see the smoke rising from hotels, shops, and buses, all linked in one way or another to the regime that promised reform but delivered silence. For many Tanzanians, this is not just anger, it's exhaustion. Years of being ignored, mocked, and censored have boiled over into a collective cry: Samia must go. And then something shifted. The protests stopped being about politics and started being about justice, raw personal justice. People are not only turning against the government, they're turning against those who stood beside it. Even the president's own son has not been spared. His hotel gone. His luxury car burned to ashes. The message is clear: no one close to power is safe anymore. But here's the deeper question: is this the sound of democracy collapsing, or of a people finally waking up? Has Tanzania crossed the line of no return? Or is this the painful beginning of rebirth? Across Africa, eyes are watching. From Nairobi to Ouagadougou, from Accra to Washington, the world is asking, how far can this fire spread before it consumes everything? If you believe that truth should not be silenced by fear, stay with us. Please share this story if you believe Africa deserves leaders of integrity. And subscribe if you think justice, not power, should define the future of this continent. The first sparks appeared quietly: a few posts on social media, whispers in the markets, murmurs in commuter buses. But within hours, those sparks turned into a wildfire. On the morning of October 29, 2025, the streets of Tanzania were no longer silent. Crowds poured out from the alleys of Dar es Salaam, from the ports of Mwanza, from the mountain streets of Arusha. Young people, the same generation once told to wait their turn, were now the ones leading the march. At first, the demands were simple: transparency, fairness, a voice. But when the police began firing tear gas into peaceful gatherings, something inside the crowd broke. The chants grew louder, the slogans sharper. Samia must go, and no justice, no peace. The people of Tanzania had seen elections where the winner was chosen before the vote. They had seen journalists arrested for asking questions. They had seen opposition leaders jailed without trial. And now they had seen enough. In Arusha, the protests turned into something no one could control. Around midnight, a group of demonstrators surrounded the Royal Palm Hotel, owned by Abdul Samir Hassan, the president's son. Moments later, flames tore through its walls. Witnesses said the fire started after angry youths shouted, "Let them feel what hunger feels like." His new Toyota Alphard, parked just outside, melted in the heat. The scene became a symbol, a nation's fury finally touching the untouchable. From there, the chaos spread like wind through dry grass. In Dar es Salaam, roadblocks appeared across main highways. Tires burned. The police, overwhelmed and outnumbered, retreated to their stations. Protesters seized intersections, chanting and waving torn campaign posters. City buses stopped running. Food vendors fled. The capital, usually alive with trade, had become a ghost city wrapped in smoke. Meanwhile, in Mwanza, looters targeted warehouses belonging to firms tied to the ruling party. At first, they took food. Then, they took electronics. By dawn, entire blocks had been reduced to rubble. The government called it criminal unrest. The people called it justice. State media tried to downplay the events, showing reruns of presidential speeches and patriotic songs. But the truth was too big to hide. Videos of the burning hotel, the crowds in Arusha, and the armored vehicles retreating from the protests flooded WhatsApp and Telegram before the internet blackout hit. And then, when the government pulled the plug, when every app went dark, when messages stopped sending, when voices disappeared from the digital space, the streets grew louder. The silence of the internet only fueled the roar of the crowd. By the second night, Tanzania was unrecognizable. The smell of tear gas mixed with that of burning plastic. Helicopters circled over Dar es Salaam. Hospitals overflowed with the injured, many from gunfire. And yet no one was giving up. This was no longer a movement organized by political parties. It was organic, chaotic, and leaderless, the kind of rebellion that no one can negotiate with. It wasn't about ideology anymore. It was about betrayal. To many Tanzanians, the government had promised reform, but delivered repression. They remembered President Samia Suluhu's rise to power, the optimism, the talk of women's leadership, unity, and inclusion. But as years passed, censorship tightened, opposition voices vanished, and ordinary citizens became statistics of silence. The young felt it most. They saw their future being sold, jobs gone, prices rising, the same faces in power. And so when the protests came, they did not wait for permission. They took to the streets armed with phones, flags, and fury. By the third day, Tanzania was living in two realities, the one shown on state television, where everything was under control, and the one everyone could see outside their windows, barricades, smoke, and a nation finally saying enough. For the first time in decades, the palace in Dar es Salaam felt the tremor of people's rage. The circle of power, once untouchable, was now under siege, and amid the chaos, one truth became undeniable. This was no longer just a protest. It was a reckoning, a fight for dignity disguised as disorder. The second wave of the uprising didn't come from the streets, it came from the screens. When Tanzanians woke up the next morning, their timelines were flooded not with music videos or comedy skits, but with lists, names, faces, screenshots. These were the so-called collaborators, celebrities, influencers, and business owners accused of supporting the regime. The revolution had entered the digital age, and the crowd had found a new battlefield: social media. One by one, familiar names appeared. Shilole, one of Tanzania's most beloved singers, whose restaurant Shishi Food had once been a hotspot for influencers and politicians, suddenly became a symbol of betrayal. By noon, videos emerged of her restaurant in Barlam engulfed in flames. Her staff fled as angry demonstrators shouted, "She sang for them while we starved." The same people who once lined up to take selfies with her now posted her downfall online with captions like, "Justice for the poor." Not far away, Nangatronics, a tech retail chain linked to a pro-government influencer, was looted and destroyed. Shelves were emptied, windows shattered, and the store's bright green logo, once a mark of success, was torn down and replaced with graffiti reading, "Thieves of the People." Then came the most shocking attack. Esther Coach Company, a transport firm owned by the finance minister's family, was set on fire. Its buses burned on live video streamed before the internet blackout returned. The footage spread like wildfire through encrypted apps before disappearing into digital silence. The streets of Dar es Salaam, Arusha, and Mwanza were no longer just centers of protest. They had become theaters of vengeance. For decades, Tanzanians had been told that celebrities were the pride of their nation, success stories of resilience and talent. But on that night, fame became guilt. Online millions unfollowed Diamond Platinum's Harmonize Zuchu and others who had once filled stadiums with joy. Their names trended under hashtags like "Our Face the People" and "Maud No More Silence." Diamond, who had once mocked protesters by saying, "The problem isn't Samia, it's you," Tanzanians suddenly vanished. His Instagram wiped clean. No posts, no songs, no words, silence, and in that silence, guilt. But the people weren't forgiving. "Deleting posts won't bring back the jobs we lost," one protester shouted on camera. "Apologies won't fix the hunger they ignored." For many, the internet blackout only pushed them closer together. Neighborhoods formed their own networks, passing information through radio and word of mouth. What began as spontaneous rage was turning into organization. The police, outnumbered and exhausted, were losing control. Reports surfaced that several units refused to fire on civilians. Some even joined the protesters, hiding their uniforms and marching beside them. The army's silence was ominous. No statements, no appearances, only rumors that senior officers were meeting behind closed doors. International journalists tried to report, but their signals were jammed. State television showed President Samia smiling at past events, shaking hands, inaugurating buildings, anything but the present reality. For citizens watching the smoke from their windows, this disconnect was unbearable. "They think they can lie to us forever," one woman said, clutching her child as helicopters circled overhead. But this time we're not afraid. By nightfall, the anger reached its breaking point. Crowds surrounded government buildings chanting, "If you silence us, we'll speak through fire." Molotovs lit up the skyline. In Arusha, protesters briefly took control of a local police station before dispersing at dawn. Outside Tanzania, the footage spread like electricity. African youth across the continent reposted the clips, adding messages of solidarity. "Kenya stands with you." From Ghana to Dar es Salaam, rise up. Even in the diaspora, Tanzanians abroad organized protests outside embassies demanding accountability. And yet, amid the chaos, a strange unity emerged, a collective sense that the nation was finally confronting its demons. This wasn't just a rejection of one president, it was a rejection of decades of silence. The people were reclaiming their voice even if it came through smoke and screams. When dawn broke on the fourth day, Tanzania was still burning, but something had changed. Fear had switched sides. The powerful were hiding. The silent had begun to speak. For the first time in years, Tanzanians weren't waiting for a savior, they were becoming their own. By the fifth day, the fires were not only physical, they were political. The government that once prided itself on control was now paralyzed by fear. Cabinet ministers went silent, state television cut to old broadcasts, and the president's official residence was surrounded by heavily armed guards. Tanzania had entered a new phase, not rebellion but reckoning. The civil consequences were immediate and devastating. Markets remained closed, schools suspended classes indefinitely. Transportation collapsed as fuel stations ran dry, either destroyed or seized by angry mobs. Hospitals were overwhelmed not just with injuries from clashes, but with exhaustion, hunger, and trauma. In the city of Arusha, volunteers, mostly university students, began distributing food and water where the state had vanished. It was a haunting picture, a government retreating, and the people stepping into the vacuum, but the breakdown ran deeper. Everywhere, the lines between justice and vengeance blurred. Some Tanzanians began targeting anyone remotely connected to the ruling party CCM. Civil servants were harassed, journalists accused of covering for the regime were chased from newsrooms. The national flag, once a symbol of unity, was now seen hanging upside down, a silent message of distress. The economy too was collapsing. Banks closed early, the shilling fell sharply against the dollar, foreign investors quietly suspended projects. And yet, in the markets where vendors still dared to open, people spoke with a strange sense of relief. "Let it all fall apart," one man told a reporter. "We've been broken for years now, everyone can see it." Inside government circles, panic was spreading faster than the protests. The finance minister's family, whose buses had been burned, reportedly fled to Kenya. Several members of parliament deleted their social media accounts and switched off their phones. A few governors offered to resign, but their letters went unanswered. The presidency had gone silent, no address, no statement, no apology. That silence spoke louder than words. Meanwhile, civil organizations, church leaders, and student unions began forming what they called the People's Front. Their message was simple. We will rebuild what the government destroyed, starting with trust. This new coalition didn't have leaders, uniforms, or offices. It had neighborhoods. It had mothers cooking together, students guarding intersections, doctors volunteering in makeshift clinics. It was not just resistance, it was the rebirth of civic power. But as solidarity grew, so did fear. Reports emerged of plainclothes officers infiltrating protests at night, abducting organizers, and leaving their bodies in alleys. The National Human Rights Commission warned that the country was on the verge of a humanitarian crisis. And still, the people kept marching. Across East Africa, the images shocked millions. Tanzania, the calm heart of the region, now looked like the ghost of itself. Buses lay overturned, markets in ashes, soldiers patrolling highways under a curfew no one respected. Diplomatic channels buzzed. Neighboring governments in Kenya and Uganda called for calm, fearing the unrest could spill across borders. But inside Tanzania, that calm no longer existed. What had started as a protest for justice had exposed the fragility of an entire system built on fear, privilege, and illusion. In the words of one pastor interviewed on local radio before it was shut down, when the people no longer believe in the law, they become the law. And when that happens, even power has no place to hide. By the end of the week, Tanzania was at a crossroads. Either the government would confront the truth that it had lost its moral authority, or it would continue to cling to power through force, risking a spiral no one could control. For now, the streets still belonged to the people, and the question echoing through the smoke was no longer, what will happen to the president? It was, what will happen to Tanzania? From Washington to Brussels, the images from Tanzania have forced a reckoning far beyond Africa's shores. For years, Western nations praised Tanzania as a model of stability, a quiet success story in East Africa, a country where elections were predictable, the currency steady, and foreign investments safe. But now, with the streets of Dar es Salaam burning and the government hiding behind silence, that illusion has collapsed. In the United States, the State Department released a carefully worded statement. We are monitoring the situation with concern and urge restraint on all sides. But to Tanzanians, those words meant little. For decades, Washington had invested in Tanzania's image, not its people. U.S. companies benefited from mining contracts, telecom ventures, and infrastructure projects that never reached the poor. The irony was bitter. America's call for calm came too late after years of quiet complicity. Within the U.S. Congress, a few voices broke from the script. Representative Ilhan Omar, herself of East African origin, called for an inquiry into U.S. aid flows to Tanzania, saying, "If our money strengthens oppression, then we are part of the problem." Meanwhile, think tanks in Washington debated the broader question, was this the beginning of an African Spring? Across the Atlantic, the European Union faced similar criticism. Brussels had spent millions funding election monitoring programs in Tanzania, programs that, in hindsight, seemed to legitimize manipulation rather than prevent it. Now, European diplomats were evacuating staff while publicly calling for constructive dialogue. In Nairobi, Kenya's government watched nervously. Tanzanian refugees were already crossing the border, and young Kenyans online were sharing solidarity posts using the hashtag #OneTanzaniaRevolts. Kenyan analysts warned that the unrest could ignite a regional youth awakening fueled by unemployment, corruption, and broken promises. "It's not just Tanzania," one journalist wrote, "it's the cry of a generation." In Burkina Faso, the contrast was striking. President Ibrahim Traoré, who had become a symbol of Africa's new sovereignty, addressed the crisis indirectly during a televised speech. Without naming Tanzania, he said, "A government that fears its youth has already lost its future." His words went viral across African platforms. Many saw them as a veiled warning to leaders clinging to power. Analysts in Ouagadougou drew parallels between Tanzania's chaos and the growing wave of anti-establishment sentiment sweeping the continent. From the Sahel to the Swahili coast, one commentator said, "Africa is demanding truth, not permission." Even China and Russia, two of Tanzania's economic partners, treaded carefully. Both called for stability, but neither condemned the government directly. To them, Tanzania's unrest was a reminder of how fragile their strategic footholds could become when people lose faith in authority. In the United Nations, silence dominated. The Security Council met behind closed doors, but issued no binding resolution. Observers saw this as proof of a global fatigue toward African crises, the sense that Africa's pain had become background noise. Yet, in the diaspora in London, Toronto, and Atlanta, Tanzanian expatriates organized rallies waving flags marked with ashes to symbolize their homeland's pain. They demanded that the world stop treating Africa as a case study and start listening to Africans themselves. What the world failed to grasp was that this uprising was not just about Tanzania. It was about the end of pretense, the end of a system where poverty funds privilege and silence buys stability. For the first time in decades, the global narrative about Africa was shifting not from crisis to charity, but from obedience to awakening. And somewhere between the burned streets of Dar es Salaam and the marble halls of Washington, the question began to echo. If this could happen in Tanzania, the stable one, then where is Africa truly safe from its own broken promises? As the smoke slowly settles over Dar es Salaam, a deeper silence takes its place, not the silence of peace, but of realization. Tanzania has reached a point from which there may be no easy return. The protests that began as a cry for fairness have peeled back the country's soul, revealing wounds that run far deeper than politics. This is no longer about President Samia Suluhu Hassan alone. It's about a people discovering that the true enemy was never just one leader, it was the system that allowed distance between power and truth. In the burnt streets of Arusha and Mwanza, the walls still bear slogans painted by trembling hands, "We will not be silenced again." Those words are now the heartbeat of a generation that has seen the cost of obedience, the emptiness of promises, and the courage it takes to stand when everything around you burns. But this is also the moment of choice. Tanzania, like many nations before it, stands on the thin edge between transformation and collapse. If the anger of today hardens into vengeance, the country will lose what it's fighting to protect. Yet, if this pain becomes purpose, if it gives birth to a new social contract, Tanzania could rise from these ashes stronger, more honest, more free. Across Africa, other leaders are watching, some with fear, some with denial, but they all know what this means. The era of ruling through silence is ending. From the Sahel to the Great Lakes, the people have learned something powerful, that authority without accountability cannot last forever. Even in the United States, where diplomats craft careful words and analysts debate statistics, the meaning is clear. Africa's awakening will not wait for permission, and it will not be televised politely. Burkina Faso's leader Ibrahim Traoré once said, "True sovereignty is not declared. It is lived every day by the courage of ordinary people." Tonight, that truth feels painfully alive in Tanzania. The world may try to move on, to change the channel, to call this just another African crisis, but those who have seen the flames know better. This is history in real time. And so we leave you with this question: if nations can burn from the inside out, who among us will have the courage to rebuild them from within? If you believe that the truth deserves to live longer than the lies, share this story. If you believe that Africa's future belongs to its people, not its politics, subscribe and stand with those who refuse to be silenced. Because the story of Tanzania is not just about one country. It is about all of us, about whether justice can still rise from the ashes.